was 25 when my life folded in on itself like a house of cards caught in a sudden wind. Before that, I believed in straight lines. Study hard, get the job, fall in love, climb steadily, build something solid. I thought life was a staircase. It turned out to be an ocean. At 23, I moved to a new city with 2 suitcases and a heart full of certainty. I had just graduated and landed a marketing position at a mid-sized tech startup. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like the beginning of something permanent, something adult. I rented a small apartment with crooked wooden floors and a balcony barely wide enough for a chair. On summer evenings, I'd sit outside with chamomile tea and imagine the version of myself 5 years ahead. Confident, established, glowing with quiet success. I had a boyfriend then. We'd met in college. We talked about moving together someday, about traveling, about getting a dog. I kept screenshots of apartments we might rent in the future. I saved Pinterest boards labeled Our Home. I believed in our. I believed in stability. I believed that if you were careful and kind and worked hard, life would respond with the same gentleness. I was wrong, but not in the way I thought. The startup started shrinking before it collapsed. It began with restructuring meetings, then whispered conversations in hallways, then sudden calendar invites titled Quick Check-in. One Thursday morning, my manager avoided eye contact. That was how I knew. I was called into a glass-walled conference room. HR was there. So was a man I'd only seen once before. Their faces were soft in the way people look when they're about to say something sharp. We've had to make some difficult decisions. I remember nodding as if I were watching myself from above. Severance package, 2 months. We're sorry, it's not performance-based. We wish you the best. I walked out with a cardboard box and my desk plant. The city looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Cars moved, people laughed. The cafe on the corner was still playing music. But something inside me had cracked open. That afternoon, I sat on my apartment floor and cried in a way I never had before. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet disbelief. I had done everything right. How could everything feel so wrong? Losing the job hurt my pride. Losing him broke my heart. 3 weeks after the layoff, my boyfriend asked if we could talk. I remember the way the sunlight hit the kitchen counter when he said it. I feel like we're moving in different directions. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Different directions? We had planned directions. We had saved directions. We had mapped them out. But in the months leading up to that conversation, I had been anxious, irritable, fragile. Losing my job made me question everything, including myself. I leaned on him heavily, maybe too heavily. He said, I need space to figure things out. I wanted to ask, what about us? Instead, I asked, is there someone else? He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. When he left, he took his toothbrush and the future I thought we were building. I stayed standing in the kitchen long after the door closed. I felt smaller than I had at 16, smaller than I had at 12. At 25, I lost my job and the person I thought I would marry within the same month. But the hardest part wasn't what left. It was what stayed. Silence. Days blurred together. I woke up without an alarm because there was nowhere to be. I scrolled through job listings until my eyes burned. I sent applications into digital voids that rarely replied. Friends tried to help. You'll find something better. This is just a phase. He wasn't the right one. They meant well, they really did. But when you're standing in the ruins of what you thought was your life, optimism can feel like noise. One night, I sat on my balcony wrapped in a blanket and watched the sky turn from deep blue to black. The city lights flickered on like distant stars. I whispered to myself, who am I without all of this? Without the job title? Without the relationship? Without the plan? For the first time in years, there was no roadmap, only space. And space can feel terrifying, but it can also be sacred. I didn't know it then, but that empty space would become the most important teacher of my life. 2 months after the breakup, I ran out of severance money. I had savings, but they were shrinking quickly. My rent felt heavier every month. Every rejection email chipped away at my confidence. While we were impressed with your background, I started doubting my skills. Maybe I wasn't as capable as I thought. Maybe I had just been lucky before. Anxiety crept into my body like cold water filling a room. I had trouble sleeping. I woke at 3 a.m. with a racing heart. I replayed every decision I'd ever made. Should I have stayed in my hometown? Should I have picked a different major? Should I have been less emotional with him? One afternoon, I found myself crying in the cereal aisle of a grocery store because I couldn't decide between two brands that were 50 cents apart. It wasn't about cereal, it was about control. I felt like I had none. The phone call that broke me and built me. I finally called my mother. I hadn't told her the full truth before. I didn't want to worry her. I didn't want to admit I was struggling. But that day, I sat on my bed and let the words spill out. I lost my job. We broke up. I don't know what I'm doing. There was silence on the other end. Not the heavy kind, but the listening kind. Then she said something that shifted everything. You are not what happened to you. I didn't understand it fully then, but it lodged itself inside me. She didn't offer solutions. She didn't say I should move back home. She didn't panic. She said, "This is not the end of your story. It's just a chapter you didn't expect." And suddenly, for the first time in months, I felt a small flicker of something unfamiliar. Not confidence, not clarity, possibility. At 25 and a half, I took a temporary retail job. It wasn't in my field, it didn't match my degree, it paid barely enough to cover rent. On my first day, I folded sweaters under bright fluorescent lights and smiled at customers asking about sizes. Part of me felt embarrassed. I had imagined myself climbing a corporate ladder, not standing behind a register. But something strange happened. The simplicity grounded me. Clock in, help people, fold, restock, clock out. There was no corporate politics, no late-night emails, no strategic presentations, just human interaction. An elderly woman once told me, "You have kind eyes." I carried that compliment for weeks. I started noticing small things again, the way sunlight warmed the store window, the way children laughed when they found sparkly shoes, the way strangers held doors open for each other. In losing everything that made me feel important, I started rediscovering what made me human. The turning point didn't arrive with fireworks. It came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was walking home after a late shift. The sky was streaked with pink and gold. The air smelled like rain. I paused on a bridge overlooking the river that cut through the city. For months, I had been trying to outrun the pain, filling my time, obsessing over applications, replaying conversations. That night, I did something different. I let myself feel it fully. The grief, the anger, the humiliation, the fear. I stood there and cried, not because I was weak, but because I was done pretending I was fine. And in that surrender, something unexpected happened. The pain stopped feeling like an enemy. It started feeling like information. It told me, you built your identity on things that could leave. You outsourced your worth to titles and people. You forgot who you were before the plans. That realization didn't fix my life overnight, but it gave me something more powerful than a job. It gave me awareness. Instead of applying frantically to every opening I could find, I slowed down. I asked myself questions I had never asked before. What kind of work actually energizes me? What do I value beyond salary? Who am I when no one is watching? I began journaling every morning. At first, it was messy and angry, but gradually it became curious. I realized I loved storytelling, not just marketing metrics. I loved understanding people. I loved turning emotion into words. In college, I had written essays that professors praised. I had always brushed it off as a nice skill. What if it was more than that? The idea felt fragile, almost embarrassing, but it also felt alive. So I started writing again. Blog posts no one read at first, reflections, essays about resilience and starting over. I wrote about losing everything at 25. And something unexpected happened. People responded. Strangers messaged me saying, "I feel this too." I thought I was the only one. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. My pain, which had once felt isolating, became connective. That was the first time I understood. Losing everything stripped me down to something more honest, and honesty has power. I didn't know it then, but that small blog, written from a tiny apartment with crooked floors, would become the foundation of everything that followed. When I began writing again, I didn't call it courage. I called it survival. I wrote at my small kitchen table after retail shifts, still wearing my name tag. I wrote on weekends when friends were out at brunch. I wrote instead of scrolling through my ex's social media. At first, it felt like whispering into a canyon, but whispers echo. My blog had 12 subscribers. 3 were friends, 2 were relatives, 1 was me using a different email address because I didn't want it to look empty. Still, I showed up. I wrote about the shame of moving backward when everyone else seemed to be moving forward. I wrote about comparison, about crying in grocery stores, about rebuilding self-trust when it feels shattered. I didn't polish the pain into something pretty. I told the truth. And truth, I learned, is magnetic. A woman from another state emailed me one night. "I'm 27. I just got laid off. I thought I was failing at life. Your words made me feel less alone." I read that sentence 5 times. Less alone. That was it. That was the reason. For the first time since losing everything, I didn't feel useless. I felt useful. Encouraged by a handful of messages, I decided to pitch an article to an online magazine. I spent days crafting it, revising sentences, trimming paragraphs, questioning every word. When I hit send, my heart pounded like I'd just stepped onto a stage. The rejection came 2 weeks later. "While your writing shows promise," there it was again. Shows promise. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall. Maybe the blog was just therapy. Maybe I wasn't actually good. Maybe I was romanticizing failure because it was easier than admitting I wasn't exceptional. The old voice returned. "You lost your job because you weren't valuable enough. He left because you weren't enough. This won't work either." For 2 weeks, I didn't write a single word, but silence felt worse than rejection. So one Sunday morning, with sunlight pouring across the floor, I opened my laptop again, not because I was confident, because I was stubborn. And sometimes, stubbornness is a form of faith. I realized something important around 26. Loving writing wasn't enough. If I wanted to build something sustainable, I had to treat it seriously, not as a hobby squeezed between doubts, but as a craft. So I studied. I read essays by women who had turned vulnerability into power. I analyzed structure, tone, rhythm. I listened to interviews with authors who had faced years of rejection before success. I saved money from my retail job and enrolled in an online writing course. It felt extravagant, irresponsible even, but it also felt like investing in the version of myself I was becoming. The more I learned, the more disciplined I became. I created a schedule. Write 1,000 words a day. Edit ruthlessly. Pitch once a week. I stopped waiting for inspiration. I built habits instead. Slowly, the quality of my work improved. And then, one quiet Thursday afternoon, an email arrived that made my hand shake. "We'd love to publish your piece." It wasn't a huge platform, it wasn't viral, but it was real. When I saw my name on that site, something inside me stood up straighter. Not because the world validated me, but because I hadn't quit. At 27, one of my essays gained traction online. It was titled, "When Your Life Doesn't Look Like It Should." I wrote it after attending a wedding where I felt like the only person who hadn't figured it out. I wrote about smiling in photos while silently questioning your timeline, about clapping for others while rebuilding yourself in private. It resonated. Shares multiplied, comments poured in, my inbox filled with stories from strangers across the country. A small publishing agency reached out. They asked if I had ever considered expanding my writing into a book. I reread the email at least 10 times. A book? Me? The girl who folded sweaters at 25 and cried over cereal? I almost said no. Imposter syndrome is loud, but something quieter, steadier, spoke underneath it. "Why not you?" I agreed to a call.
The call was scheduled for 10 a.m. I wore a blazer over pajama shorts because that felt like adulthood. My palms were sweaty. I had notes prepared even though I didn't know what questions in ask. The editor told me my voice felt honest and needed. Needed. That word again. She suggested a proposal centered around resilience in your 20s. Not the polished motivational kind, but the messy, in-between years no one glamorizes. After the call, I sat in silence. 5 years ago, I thought my life was ending. Now someone believed there was a book inside it. But excitement was tangled with fear. Writing blog posts was one thing. Writing a book meant excavating everything. The breakup, the layoffs, the nights I doubted my own worth. It meant being fully seen. And being seen is terrifying. But I remembered the bridge over the river. The night I stopped running from my pain. Avoidance had never freed me. Honesty had. So I said yes. 28 was not glamorous. It was long mornings writing before work. It was cutting chapters that didn't serve the story. It was reliving memories I thought I had already processed. Some days I felt powerful. Other days I felt exposed. But something profound was happening beneath the surface. I wasn't just telling a story. I was integrating it. The more I wrote about losing everything, the more I understood it differently. At 25, I saw loss as punishment. At 28, I saw it as redirection. If I hadn't been laid off, I would have stayed comfortable. If he hadn't left, I would have built a future around someone who wasn't fully aligned. If my plans hadn't collapsed, I would never have questioned them. Loss didn't ruin my life. It refined it. The book launched when I was 29. It didn't debut on bestseller lists. There were no billboards, no flashing cameras. But there was something better. There were women in bookstores holding it with tears in their eyes. There were messages from readers saying, "This helped me leave a job that was draining me." Or, "I finally ended a relationship that wasn't right." Or, "I stopped feeling ashamed for starting over." I attended small speaking events, community centers, libraries, local panels. I stood in front of rooms with shaking hands and told my story out loud. Each time I felt a little braver. Each time I remembered the girl on the kitchen floor at 25 who thought she had nothing left. She had no idea. Right before my 30th birthday, I received a message I never expected. It was from him, my ex. "I saw your book. I'm proud of you. Would you want to catch up sometime?" For a moment, my chest tightened the way it used to. 5 years ago, I would have dropped everything. But something had changed. I didn't hate him. I didn't resent him. I felt neutral. I realized I didn't need closure. I had already built it. I replied kindly but declined, not out of anger, out of growth. That was when I knew the healing was real. On my 30th birthday, I woke up early and walked back to that same bridge over the river. The city looked the same, but I didn't. 5 years ago, I stood there feeling broken. Now I stood there feeling whole. Not because life was perfect, but because I trusted myself. I had built something from nothing. I had turned loss into language, pain into purpose, silence into voice. At 25, I lost everything I thought defined me. By 30, I had the last word. Not because I won, but because I rewrote the story. And if you're standing in the ruins of your own life right now, if the job is gone, the relationship ended, the plan shattered, I want you to know something. The collapse might not be your ending. It might be your introduction. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to build next. And sometimes losing everything is the most powerful beginning of all.
There is something no one tells you about rebuilding. It's not one big transformation. It's 1,000 small decisions no one sees. After the book launched, people assumed everything felt settled. They imagined clarity arriving like sunrise, warm, steady, permanent. But growth is not a finish line. It's a practice. At 30, I was more confident than I had been at 25, but I was still human. I still had mornings where doubt knocked softly at my ribs. I still had days where comparison tried to sneak in through open windows. The difference was this: I no longer mistook doubt for truth. A few months after the launch, I was invited to speak at a larger event. Not a cozy library this time, a real conference. Hundreds of attendees, a proper stage, bright lights. When I walked into the venue during rehearsal, my stomach flipped. The stage looked enormous. The microphone felt heavier than expected. A voice whispered, "You don't belong here." 5 years earlier, that voice would have sent me running. Now, I recognized it. Fear doesn't disappear when you grow. It just loses authority. I stood on that stage during rehearsal, looked at the empty chairs, and remembered the version of me who folded sweaters under fluorescent lights, the version who thought her life was over at 25. She didn't need a perfect performance. She needed proof that we kept going. That night, when the room filled and the lights dimmed, I told the truth again. I told them about losing my job, about the breakup, about crying on the kitchen floor, about starting over in retail. The room was silent in the way that means people are listening with their whole bodies. Afterward, a woman in her early 20s approached me with tears in her eyes. "I just got fired last week," she said. "I thought I was falling behind. Hearing you, I feel hopeful." Hopeful. The word wrapped around me like warm light. This was the last word I never saw coming.
Not revenge, not validation, not proving anyone wrong. Impact. People sometimes ask me, do you ever wish things had worked out differently? They expect drama. They expect bitterness. They expect me to say I'm glad I proved everyone wrong. But the truth is softer than that. I don't want revenge. I don't want to rewrite the past. If the startup hadn't laid me off, I would have stayed safe. If he hadn't left, I would have stayed small in ways I didn't recognize. If everything had gone according to plan, I would never have discovered who I was without the plan. The quiet revenge, if you can call it that, was becoming someone I respect. It was looking in the mirror at 30 and seeing strength where there used to be fragility. Not hardness, strength. There's a difference. Hardness builds walls. Strength builds foundations. I won't romanticize it. The journey wasn't magically smooth after the book. There were months where royalties were lower than expected, speaking engagements fluctuated, freelance contracts came and went. Creative careers are not straight lines either. But because I had already survived the collapse at 25, instability no longer terrified me. I built an emergency fund. I diversified income streams. I learned about contracts, taxes, negotiations, things I used to avoid because they felt intimidating. Losing everything once forced me to understand money differently. I stopped seeing it as proof of worth and started seeing it as a tool. Stability became something I constructed intentionally, not something I assumed would always be there. There is deep power in knowing you can rebuild. It makes risk less paralyzing. At 30, I also understood love differently. I used to believe love meant merging futures immediately, planning, projecting, attaching tightly. Now love felt steadier. I met someone unexpectedly at a friend's dinner party. He didn't know my full story at first. He didn't approach me because of the book or the talks. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened carefully. He didn't try to rescue me or impress me. There was no urgency, just presence. The old me might have rushed to define everything. The new me let it unfold slowly. When I eventually told him about losing everything at 25, about the heartbreak and fear, he didn't flinch. He said, "That's brave. Not tragic, not dramatic, brave." For the first time, love didn't feel like something I needed to complete me. It felt like something I could choose from wholeness, and that changed everything. On the anniversary of my layoff, I did something intentional. I opened the old email, the one that began with, "We've had to make some difficult decisions." I read it slowly. 5 years earlier, that email felt like a door slamming shut. Now it felt like a door that redirected me toward a different hallway. I didn't feel anger. I felt gratitude, not because losing my job was pleasant, but because it revealed resilience I didn't know I had. The version of me at 25 thought losing everything meant losing identity. The version of me at 30 understands. Identity is not what you hold. It's what you build when your hands are empty. When I say I had the last word by 30, I don't mean I stood on a mountaintop and declared victory. I mean something quieter. I stopped letting my worst moment narrate my life. At 25, the story sounded like this. You failed. You weren't enough. You lost. At 30, the story sounds different. You adapted. You learned. You created. You grew. The facts of what happened didn't change. The meaning did. And meaning is powerful. If you're 25 right now and everything feels like it's collapsing, I see you. If you're 30 and still rebuilding, I see you. If you're somewhere in between, unsure whether this chapter is failure or formation, I promise you it can be formation. You are allowed to start over. You are allowed to pivot. You are allowed to outgrow the version of yourself that once thought this was the end. Losing everything at 25 didn't destroy me. It introduced me to myself. And by 30, when life asked who I was without the titles, without the relationship, without the certainty, I had an answer. I am the girl who rebuilds.
There is one more truth I have to tell you. By 30, I didn't just rebuild my life. I forgave it. That may sound strange, but for a long time, I carried quiet resentment toward the years that unraveled me. I thought those years stole something from me. Time, dignity, certainty. What I didn't see then was this. They gave me dimension. When I was younger, I believed there was a correct sequence to life. Graduate, get hired, advance, commit, stabilize. Deviation felt like failure. But by 30, I had met too many people with nonlinear stories to keep believing in straight lines. A mentor once told me, "Your path doesn't need to make sense to others. It only needs to make sense to you." At 25, I would have nodded politely without understanding. At 30, I live by it. The startup collapsing forced me to question what kind of work mattered to me. The breakup forced me to question what kind of love I deserved. Financial instability forced me to question how I defined security. Each loss peeled back assumptions I didn't even know I was carrying. The right path turned out to be the one that made me more myself, not the one that impressed the most people. There was a moment during my 30th year that crystallized everything. I was invited to record a podcast interview about resilience. Not a massive show, but large enough that I knew thousands would hear it. Before recording, I sat quietly with my notes. I could have told the polished version of my story, the tidy arc, the motivational highlights, but something in me resisted that. So when the host asked, what was the lowest point, I didn't soften it. I described the cereal aisle, the 3 a.m. anxiety, the humiliation of starting over. My voice trembled slightly, not from shame, but from honesty. After the episode aired, messages poured in, not praising success, thinking vulnerability. That's when it hit me fully. The power was never in the comeback. It was in the transparency. At 25, I hid my struggle because I thought struggle was weakness. At 30, I understand that naming struggle is strength. The most radical transformation wasn't professional, it was internal. At 25, my worth fluctuated with outcomes. If I was employed, I felt valuable. If I was loved, I felt chosen. If I was progressing, I felt adequate. When those things disappeared, so did my sense of worth. By 30, that equation changed. My worth no longer spikes or crashes based on circumstance. It is steady, because it is rooted in character, not achievement. I know I am disciplined. I know I am resilient. I know I am compassionate. I know I can rebuild. Those truths don't evaporate when a contract ends or a relationship shifts. That stability is the real success. Everything else is surface. There's something I've never shared publicly until now. At 29, right before my birthday, I ran into my former manager, the one who had sat in that glass-walled conference room 5 years earlier. We crossed paths at a cafe. For a split second, my body reacted like it was 25 again. Tight chest, quick breath. He recognized me immediately. "I've seen what you've been doing," he said. "It's impressive." We spoke for a few minutes. He mentioned how difficult that period had been for the company, how layoffs had affected everyone. There was no dramatic apology, no cinematic redemption, just normal conversation. And that normalcy was powerful, because I realized something. I no longer needed him to validate or regret what happened. His opinion didn't define that chapter anymore. I walked away from that cafe lighter, not because I had won, but because I was no longer carrying it. Growth always gets tested. During my 30th year, a large project I had invested months in fell apart unexpectedly. Funding shifted, contracts dissolved. 5 years earlier, that kind of setback would have shattered me. This time, I allowed myself one evening of disappointment. I lit a candle, I journaled honestly, I felt it fully. Then the next morning, I made a plan. I reached out to contracts, I brainstormed alternatives, I adapted. No spiral, no identity crisis, just response. That's when I understood how far I had come. Resilience isn't about avoiding future setbacks. It's about shortening the distance between fall and recovery. At 25, I collapsed. At 30, I recalibrated. When I say I had the last word by 30, I don't mean the world applauded. I mean I stopped arguing with reality. I stopped demanding that life follow my original script. I stopped tying my worth to timing. The last word was acceptance. Not passive acceptance, empowered acceptance. The kind that says, this happened, it hurt, I learned, I grew, and I am still here. Still here, stronger, wiser, softer in the right ways. 5 years can turn heartbreak into discernment, turn unemployment into redirection, turn insecurity into grounded confidence, turn shame into storytelling. 5 years can take a girl who believed she had lost everything and introduce her to a woman who understands she never truly did. Because what mattered most, curiosity, kindness, courage, remained. They were simply waiting to be activated. If you measure your life by what has fallen apart, you will always feel behind. If you measure your life by what you have built from what fell apart, you will see progress everywhere. At 25, I thought my life was over. At 30, I understand it was just beginning. And now, when fear tries to whisper again, because it still does sometimes, I smile gently, because I've heard that voice before. And I know something it doesn't. I rebuild. Every time.
There is one more truth I have to tell you. By 30, I didn't just rebuild my life, I forgave it. That may sound strange, but for a long time, I carried quiet resentment toward the years that unraveled me. I thought those years stole something from me: time, dignity, certainty. What I didn't see then was this: they gave me dimension. When I was younger, I believed there was a correct sequence to life: graduate, get hired, advance, commit, stabilize. Deviation felt like failure.
But by 30, I had met too many people with nonlinear stories to keep believing in straight lines. A mentor once told me, "Your path doesn't need to make sense to others. It only needs to make sense to you." At 25, I would have nodded politely without understanding. At 30, I live by it. The startup collapsing forced me to question what kind of work mattered to me. The breakup forced me to question what kind of love I deserved. Financial instability forced me to question how I define security. Each loss peeled back assumptions I didn't even know I was carrying. The right path turned out to be the one that made me more myself, not the one that impressed the most people. The courage to be seen. There was a moment during my 30th year that crystallized everything. I was invited to record a podcast interview about resilience. Not a massive show, but large enough that I knew thousands would hear it. Before recording, I sat quietly with my notes. I could have told the polished version of my story, the tidy arc, the motivational highlights, but something in me resisted that. So when the host asked, "What was the lowest point?" I didn't soften it. I described the cereal aisle, the 3 a.m. anxiety, the humiliation of starting over. My voice trembled slightly, not from shame, but from honesty. After the episode aired, messages poured in, not praising success, thanking vulnerability. That's when it hit me fully. The power was never in the comeback. It was in the transparency. At 25, I hid my struggle because I thought struggle was weakness. At 30, I understand that naming struggle is strength. The most radical transformation wasn't professional. It was internal. At 25, my worth fluctuated with outcomes. If I was employed, I felt valuable. If I was loved, I felt chosen. If I was progressing, I felt adequate. When those things disappeared, so did my sense of worth. By 30, that equation changed. My worth no longer spikes or crashes based on circumstance. It is steady. Because it is rooted in character, not achievement. I know I am disciplined. I know I am resilient. I know I am compassionate. I know I can rebuild. Those truths don't evaporate when a contract ends or a relationship shifts. That stability is the real success. Everything else is surface. There's something I've never shared publicly until now. At 29, right before my birthday, I ran into my former manager, the one who had sat in that glass-walled conference room 5 years earlier. We crossed paths at a cafe. For a split second, my body reacted like it was 25 again. Tight chest, quick breath. He recognized me immediately. "I've seen what you've been doing," he said. "It's impressive." We spoke for a few minutes. He mentioned how difficult that period had been for the company, how layoffs had affected everyone. There was no dramatic apology, no cinematic redemption, just normal conversation. And that normalcy was powerful. Because I realized something. I no longer needed him to validate or regret what happened. His opinion didn't define that chapter anymore. I walked away from that cafe lighter. Not because I had won, but because I was no longer carrying it. Growth always gets tested. During my 30th year, a large project I had invested months in fell apart unexpectedly. Funding shifted, contracts dissolved. 5 years earlier, that kind of setback would have shattered me. This time, I allowed myself one evening of disappointment. I lit a candle, I journaled honestly, I felt it fully. Then the next morning, I made a plan. I reached out to contacts, I brainstormed alternatives, I adapted. No spiral, no identity crisis, just response. That's when I understood how far I had come. Resilience isn't about avoiding future setbacks. It's about shortening the distance between fall and recovery. At 25, I collapsed. At 30, I recalibrated. When I say I had the last word by 30, I don't mean the world applauded. I mean I stopped arguing with reality. I stopped demanding that life follow my original script. I stopped tying my worth to timing. The last word was acceptance. Not passive acceptance, empowered acceptance, the kind that says, "This happened, it hurt, I learned, I grew, and I am still here." Still here, stronger, wiser, softer in the right ways. 5 years can. Turn heartbreak into discernment. Turn unemployment into redirection. Turn insecurity into grounded confidence. Turn shame into storytelling. 5 years can take a girl who believed she had lost everything and introduce her to a woman who understands she never truly did. Because what mattered most, curiosity, kindness, courage, remained. They were simply waiting to be activated. If you measure your life by what has fallen apart, you will always feel behind. If you measure your life by what you have built from what fell apart, you will see progress everywhere. At 25, I thought my life was over. At 30, I understand it was just beginning. And now when fear tries to whisper again, because it still does sometimes, I smile gently. Because I've heard that voice before. And I know something it doesn't. I rebuild. Every time.
There is a version of me that still lives in memory. 25, sitting on a kitchen floor, back against a cabinet,
wondering how everything disappeared so quickly. Sometimes I visit her, not with regret, with tenderness, because she thought she had lost everything. But what she had really lost were illusions. And illusions are heavy. When I look back now, I see how tightly I clung to expectations. By 25, I believed I should be established in a stable career, in a long-term relationship heading toward marriage, financially comfortable, certain of my path. Should is a dangerous word. It sounds responsible, but often it's just inherited pressure. Some of those expectations were cultural. Some came from social media. Some were stitched together from watching peers announce promotions and engagements online. Comparison is quiet but corrosive. At 25, I wasn't just grieving a job and a relationship. I was grieving the timeline I thought proved I was doing life correctly. It took me years to understand something profound. There is no universal clock. There is only growth. And growth doesn't run on a schedule. After my story gained visibility, strangers began sharing their own. A woman who divorced at 32, a man who switched careers at 38, a mother who started a business at 45 after raising children for decades. Their stories cracked something open inside me. Failure wasn't the exception. It was the curriculum. Most people just don't talk about it publicly. We celebrate outcomes. We hide transitions. But transitions are where character forms. At 25, I thought I was uniquely behind. By 30, I understood I was deeply human. Something subtle but powerful happened between 25 and 30. I stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and started asking, "What is this teaching me?" That shift changed everything. When freelance work fell through, instead of spiraling into panic, I evaluated strategy. When criticism came, and it did, instead of internalizing it as proof of inadequacy, I filtered it. Is this useful? Is this projection? Resilience is not about becoming unbreakable. It's about becoming adaptable. The girl at 25 thought stability meant external security. The woman at 30 understands stability as internal trust. I trust myself now. To learn, to pivot, to survive discomfort, to rebuild if necessary. And that trust is worth more than any title I lost. I still walk to that river bridge sometimes. Not because I'm sad, but because it reminds me. The city skyline shifts slowly over time. Buildings rise, old storefronts close, new ones open. Nothing stays fixed. Why did I expect my life to? One evening recently, I leaned against the railing and watched the water move below. It didn't rush. It didn't resist obstacles. It flowed around them. There is so much wisdom in that. At 25, I tried to fight the current. I exhausted myself trying to drag my old life back into place. At 30, I flow. That doesn't mean passivity. It means responsiveness. It means choosing direction without forcing permanence. For a long time, I framed the breakup as rejection. But distance brought clarity. We were good people, just not a long term. At 25, I mistake compatibility for destiny. I ignored subtle misalignments because I feared starting over more than settling. Losing him forced me to confront that fear. It forced me to ask, would I rather be chosen or be aligned? That question reshaped how I see love. I no longer chase potential. I choose presence. I no longer cling to avoid loneliness. I cultivate connection without abandoning myself. If he hadn't left, I might never have learned that. Sometimes what feels like abandonment is redirection toward better fit. One of the hardest but most empowering lessons came through money. When I lost my job, I felt ashamed that I hadn't built a bigger safety net. I avoided looking at my bank account because it triggered anxiety. Now I look directly. I track, I plan, I save. Not obsessively. Intentionally. Losing income once taught me not to romanticize security. It taught me to build it. I learned negotiation skills. I stopped underpricing my work. I began saying no to opportunities that undervalued me. Confidence isn't just emotional. It's practical. By 30, I wasn't just stronger internally, I was smarter strategically. Loss sharpened me. People assume having the last word means proving someone wrong. But my last word wasn't directed at my ex. It wasn't directed at my former employer. It wasn't even directed at the critics who said creative work wasn't practical. My last word was directed at fear. At the voice that said, "You're behind. You're failing. You're not enough." The last word was this: watch me grow anyway. Not loudly, not arrogantly, but steadily. Growth is the most powerful response to doubt. If I could sit beside her on that kitchen floor, I wouldn't rush to reassure her that everything turns out perfectly. Because life doesn't turn out perfectly. It turns out real. I would tell her, this pain is not proof of inadequacy. This ending is not a verdict. This confusion is not permanent. I would tell her that 5 years from now she will speak into microphones without shaking. That her words will sit on bookshelves. That she will love again without losing herself. That she will understand money, boundaries, alignment, and resilience in ways she can't imagine. I would tell her that losing everything is not the same as losing herself. And maybe most importantly, I would tell her that she is allowed to rewrite the script. If you are in your own 25 moment, whatever age you are, here's what I hope you hear clearly. The collapse is not the conclusion. It is construction disguised as chaos. You may not see what is being built yet. You may feel embarrassed, uncertain, exposed. But you are gathering skills you will use later. You are building depth that cannot be taught in comfort. You are learning how to stand without leaning too heavily on things that can disappear. And one day, maybe 5 years from now, maybe sooner, you will look back at this chapter with softer eyes. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it shaped you. I lost everything at 25. The job, the relationship, the certainty. By 30, I didn't just rebuild. I understood. I understood that identity is not a position, that love is not possession, that security is not guaranteed, that failure is not final. And most of all, I understood that when life takes the script out of your hands, you are allowed to pick up a pen and write anyway. If this is your beginning, even if it feels like an ending, keep going. There is a version of you 5 years from now who will be grateful you did.
There is a quiet kind of power that only comes after you've watched your life fall apart and realized you survived it. By 30, I no longer feared collapse the way I once did, not because I wanted things to fall apart again, but because I understood something unshakable. I am not fragile. I bend, I grieve, I doubt, I question, but I do not disappear. For a while, my story of losing everything at 25 became my identity. It was the hinge point of my narrative, the origin story. But one afternoon, after finishing a talk, a young woman approached me and said something that startled me. I hope I don't need to lose everything to find myself. Her words stayed with me, because she was right. Pain had shaped me, but it wasn't the only teacher available. Growth doesn't require devastation. It requires awareness. That realization shifted how I saw my own story. I stopped glorifying the collapse. I stopped framing it as necessary suffering. It was formative, but it wasn't the only path. And I don't define myself by what I lost anymore. I define myself by what I built. 30 isn't perfect. Let me tell you something honest. Turning 30 did not mean I suddenly had life mastered. There are still unanswered questions. There are still ambitions unfolding. There are still moments of uncertainty. But uncertainty no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like open space. At 25, uncertainty felt like falling without a net. At 30, uncertainty feels like possibility.
That shift is everything. The most profound difference between who I was at 25 and who I am at 30 isn't external. It's the way I speak to myself. At 25, when things fell apart, I said, "You messed up. You should have seen this coming. You're behind." At 30, when something goes wrong, I say, "Okay, this hurts. What can we learn? What's the next small step?" The tone is different, gentler, stronger, rooted. Self-compassion is not softness. It is fuel. Not long ago, I had a moment that felt symbolic. I was alone in my apartment, a different one now, brighter, steadier. The floors don't creak, the balcony is wide enough for 2 chairs. I was reviewing goals for the next few years, and I felt a flicker of doubt. What if this doesn't last? What if things fall apart again? Fear was back. But instead of pushing it away, I did something new. I answered it. If things fall apart again, I will rebuild again. The sentence landed with calm certainty, not bravado, truth. That is the last word. Not that nothing will ever go wrong, but that I trust myself if it does. When I say I lost everything at 25, that isn't entirely accurate. Here's what I truly lost: the illusion that life is controllable, the need for external validation, the timeline I thought I had to follow, the fear of starting over. What I gained was far greater: resilience, self-trust, discernment and love, financial awareness, creative courage, emotional depth. Loss rearranged me, but it did not erase me. On the evening of my 30th birthday, I returned to the bridge one more time. The sky was painted in lavender and gold. The river moved steadily beneath me. The air was cool, brushing gently against my skin. 5 years earlier, I had stood there asking, "Who am I without everything?" Now I knew. I am the girl who learned to sit with discomfort instead of run from it. I am the woman who built a voice from silence. I am someone who understands that endings are not verdicts. I closed my eyes and felt gratitude, not just for the success, not just for the rebuilt stability, but for the girl who kept going when she didn't see the outcome yet. She is the reason I'm here. If you are in a season where everything feels stripped away, hear this. You are not being punished. You are being expanded. Expansion rarely feels comfortable. It stretches you beyond who you were. It asks you to release identities that no longer fit. It invites you to build something more aligned. And sometimes it arrives disguised as loss. The real meaning of the last word. The last word is not revenge. It is not proving doubters wrong. It is not flaunting success. The last word is reclaiming authorship. It is deciding that what happened to you will not be the loudest voice in your life. It is choosing growth over bitterness. It is looking at your own reflection and recognizing strength you once overlooked. By 30, I had the last word because I no longer let my worst chapter narrate my entire book. I turned the page, and then I kept writing. If you are standing in your own collapse right now, I won't tell you it's easy. It isn't. I won't tell you it won't hurt. It will. But I will tell you this. You are more adaptable than you think. You are more capable than you feel. You are more resilient than your fear suggests. And 5 years from now, you may stand somewhere, maybe on a literal bridge, maybe in a quiet room, maybe in the middle of a life you built from scratch, and realize you didn't lose everything. You lost what wasn't meant to stay. And in the space it left behind, you found yourself. That was my story. And by 30, I had the last word.